Welcome to the All Things Endurance podcast. I'm your host, Rick Prince, and today we have physical therapist on our show, Dr. Sammie Lewis, and she runs a physical therapy practice in Golden, Colorado with her husband, Gabe. It is appropriately named. Her practice is Golden Endurance. She primarily works with endurance athletes, a lot of ultra runners. She was actually a speaker, presenter at our conference that we just had, our ultra running conference this past September. So on the podcast today, we're going to be discussing injury prevention and intervention. So myths, some things that would be really helpful for hopefully for you to add into your training, or if you coach athletes, some things that you can work with your athletes. So, Sammie, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This should be fun.
Yeah, definitely. So, if we could start off with, I think a lot of athletes, I don't know if they don't go to physical therapy because they're afraid, or their doctors are afraid they're going to tell them not to run, or or ride, or whatnot. Um, but that being said, I feel like physical therapy is usually used as an intervention tool, right? Like I have a pain, or I'm injured, I need to go see a physical therapist. But let's talk about what becomes before that, which I think is highly underused and highly underutilized, is prehab. So maybe you could discuss exactly what prehab is, and I guess according to you, is it important, and should all athletes, and especially endurance athletes, be doing it?
Yeah. So, first off, it depends on where you're going on if you can really get like prehab services from a PT or not. Just unfortunately with the insurance model that most people run with, insurance won't cover things unless you have pain.
Got it.
So that's not all the time. So it just kind of depends. But that's one of the reasons that we don't see people before they're injured a lot of the time, is just because insurance won't cover it.
Right.
But there's clinics like our own. We don't directly work through insurance. We're cash pay. So prehab is a huge part of our business, because we'd rather see you before you're hurt and prevent you from getting hurt in a lot less time than you actually have to stop running or cycling or whatever your sport is. But as for like what it is and what it looks like, we take a step back, and I mean, most injuries to an endurance athletes are overuse injuries. There's most of them aren't traumatic. That's a whole different other thing. But overuse means that there's a mismatch between the load being placed on a tissue and then the capacity or the load tolerance of that tissue. So
Okay.
basically, you're doing too much for what your body can handle. Prehab is spending like the time and putting in the work and energy to increase the load capacity of those tissues so that you can load more, which means you can train more, you can run more, or run harder, all those things. The body is having to absorb forces that are many, many times the amount of body weight during every step of running. So up to 12 times body weight has to go through the Achilles on every step. So like it takes a lot of resilience to be able to withstand those types of forces over and over and over again. Not to mention that tendons and bone take a lot longer to adapt than the cardiovascular system, which means that when people get in trouble is that they're getting a lot of fitness. And so they're running to run more and run faster because they feel like they can, but their bones and tendons aren't ready for it. So prehab is a way that we can load in different ways, bones and tendons, to kind of help close the gap and make you be able to do the things that you want to do.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Is part of prehab as well, do you guys do anything like, as far as whether it be gait analysis, or if there's anything wonky mechanically to say, okay, this could potentially be indicative of an injury down the road, or it could, it looks a little weird, maybe we should address this, or is it mostly kind of looking at what you had mentioned, sort of the load issues?
Yeah. I always look at the way people move in general, but not necessarily the way they run.
Okay.
We have tons of research actually that tell us that we cannot predict who is going to get injured from watching them run.
Gotcha.
So if somebody's like a very beginner runner, I might put them on the treadmill to see kind of baseline, just like what their cadence is. That is one thing that we know is linked to just your slow cadence, the more force on the body, the more likely you are to kind of overload tissues. So I might look for that. But if somebody doesn't have pain, I am not going to be trying to adjust their running form.
Mhm.
You run the way you do for a reason. It is what is most biomechanically efficient for you. So I'm not going to mess with that just to make it look pretty.
Right. Gotcha. Gotcha. That being said, do you find runners that actually get into trouble because they run the way they do and then they see, you know, I don't know, Meb Keflezighi in a video like, okay, I want to run like him. And they try to adopt that style and then get themselves actually into trouble by trying to correct something that doesn't need to be corrected?
Yep, definitely. Um,
Okay.
I'd say a lot of people like heel striking has been villainized in just social media and pop culture and whatever. We know that 70 to 80% of runners heel strike, but then they suddenly think that it's a bad thing and try and forefoot strike and don't have the calf capacity to do that, and it causes all types of problems.
Yeah.
Um, so for the most part, if you are changing your running form for any type of reason, you better be also looking at why you ran that way in the first place,
Yeah.
and adjusting things from that side as well.
Okay. Makes sense. Makes sense. So I guess moving on to the next question, both from this perspective of injury prevention and intervention. I mean, I feel like maybe it's because I'm in this industry, right? Like I feel like there's not every other Facebook ad I get is something having to do with recovery boots, a Theragun, a foam roller, the market, I don't know how much money this market's worth, but it's a lot. Um, all of them make claims to, reduce injury or speed up recovery. What are your thoughts on some of these tools? And maybe I know it's sort of a blanket statement to just kind of maybe lump these all into the same, but any thoughts on even maybe the marketing of it or how athletes should or should not use these?
Yeah. I don't know if it's because I'm in this space too, because I get those all the time. And I don't know if it's
Yeah.
because I talk so much about in general how they don't work, so they keep trying to market to me and prove me wrong. But
Right.
um
They're going to keep shoving it down your throat until you
yeah.
start
I
believing it.
Yeah, I saw something the other day. It was like this little strap that you put around your leg, and they were talking about how it increases blood flow by 4 times, and it was just comical. Um, so there's a ton of stuff out there. Um, in short, for like a performance benefit and recovery benefit for performance, all of them are far inferior to just sleeping,
Mm,
hydrating well, eating well.
got it.
It's really the basics are the basics for a reason.
Yeah.
And honestly, very few people have mastered those three things.
Yeah. Sure.
Now if we're going into like injuries, and in PT, we use those things a little bit more. Let's say like foam rolling, dry needling, kind of stuff like that. The goal for most of that stuff is to tone down your nervous system to give what we call a therapeutic window. And
Okay.
that's kind of a window of less pain. So then you can actively rehab and do things that actually make you better during that time of less pain.
Interesting. Okay.
If you're going and you're just dry needling the same thing over and over and over again, you're and not doing anything else, you're not improving anything. You're just giving them this little bit of pain relief and then just letting it revert to the way it was before.
Okay.
Um, so we do use those things more in PT. I mean, I tell people to foam roll sometimes, but that's definitely not the only thing I'm telling them to do.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
So you're saying basically if I have an extra $2,000 in my bank account that I need to burn, it should maybe be on prehab and not necessarily on those recovery boots, perhaps.
probably. I would say prehab and maybe a good nutritionist,
Okay. Okay.
because nobody is as good at their nutrition as they think they are.
Right. Yeah. That's for sure. Certainly,
Mhm.
certainly in my case, that's the case.
Yeah.
Um, So you mentioned foam rolling, and I feel like that's one of the more popular, quote unquote recovery or therapy tools or whatnot that runners, cyclists, triathletes use. Any sort of no-nos when it comes to foam rolling? Because I think that there's this almost that no pain, no gain. If I'm foam rolling and it doesn't hurt like hell, then it's not doing anything. So I got to make it hurt a lot,
Yeah.
especially on my IT band and all of that. So any things for our listeners that they, I guess, should or should not be doing when it comes to foam rolling?
Yeah. I mean, foam rolling in any of this stuff it actually shouldn't hurt really bad.
Okay.
I tell people, like, a mild to moderate amount of discomfort, that's fine. That means you're like getting into the tissue. But back to like what we're going for is a nervous system response. Like we're trying to make your nervous system calm down so that the muscles calm down instead of being in this heightened fight or flight mode all the time. If you are just creating a lot of pain, they're not going to calm down.
Right.
They're
Kind
going
of
to
the
keep
opposite, right?
they're going to keep hurting because you're telling your nervous system that there's something dangerous happening to your leg or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, definitely not a no pain, no gain. It should be like mildly uncomfortable. You're putting pressure there, but it shouldn't be excruciating. It shouldn't be sharp. And then again, if you are just rolling the same thing over and over and over again, and it just keeps returning, that means you have to do something else.
Yeah.
Like it is not fixing your problem.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a good, because I'm sure a lot of people, maybe in other parts of people's lives, they appreciate that if you do the same thing over again without I mean, isn't that the definition of insanity, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like when it comes to this stuff, just people keep doing the same thing. It's creature habit. If I just keep doing it more and more and more, even if it takes me 10 years, that's what I have to do. So,
Yeah. And if you don't have pain, there's not, or like any injuries that you're trying to keep at bay or a big injury history, that's not the type of stuff that you really need to be concerning yourself with. It's
right.
not, foam rolling is not increasing your tissue capacity to do more work.
Mhm.
It's just giving you like a couple minute window where you're like, oh, I feel a little better.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think a lot of our listeners that are, maybe have been in endurance sports for a while, or physical therapists or trainers, obviously understand what the kinetic chain is. But it's not a term I think that is maybe common. And I think it affects how athletes, treat either injuries or again, back to the prehab thing. Could you explain a little bit about what kinetic chain is and maybe even a few examples?
Yeah, for sure. So the kinetic chain is basically just a word for saying that the body is all put together and is one unit.
Okay.
Your ankle is not completely separate from your knee, completely separate from your hip. All of those things are working together to have you form movement. So in the instance of running, which is what I work with the most, if somebody is having like medial ankle pain, yes, we're going to assess their medial ankle, but we're also going to be assessing up the kinetic chain and seeing what's happening at the hip, what's happening at the knee, kind of what the whole entire system's doing, because it actually might not be an ankle problem at all. That might be where the pain is popping up because there's just being excessive forces going through that ankle, but it could be because your lateral hip is weak and you're doing this funky crossover step and putting a lot of force at that ankle. So, yeah, you just need to be looking at the whole body and
Okay.
not just what is happening at one single area. And that's why, like, most people go to PT and they get glute exercises.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's wrong. I give glute exercises all the time, but a lot of people don't understand why. They're like, oh,
Yeah.
everything stems from weak glutes. That's not exactly true. It's just more that the glutes are kind of like your foundation, like they're the first thing there. So if they're not strong in doing funky things, everything down the chain is going to be a little wonky.
Gotcha.
You can't fix it from the other way up nearly as well as like from that central area out.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
why everybody gets glute exercises. Almost
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I was in rehab, in PT, I got glute exercises for sure.
Yeah.
A lot of
And
glute.
I can go on a whole nother tangent about that, but that's why they get them is the kinetic chain.
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. So that being said, going back to the previous thing about the recovery stuff, I would imagine too, then a lot of people that are sort of, are using these recovery tools or whatnot without a PT's, advice are focusing on an area that might not even be the area, right? They're focusing on the area of referred pain versus the
Right.
origin of the the origin of the problem,
Yeah.
whatever that may or may not be.
Right. And that's why, like, it makes you feel better for a little bit, and then you go out for your run the next day and it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
That you're not fixing any problem.
Got it. So what are some of the biggest myths, and maybe you come across this with your patients all the time, I'm guessing, but what are some of the biggest myths out there with respect to recovery and injury prevention, whether it be stuff that we see a lot in social media again, or just stuff that you're hearing from patients that maybe these evergreen myths that just won't die?
Yeah. The biggest thing for kind of both recovery and injury prevention, honestly, is just that you can cheat it. So like we're always looking for the modalities or the thing that to take a shortcut or speed it up, especially when people are injured. They're trying to do everything they can to speed
Sure.
up their recovery, right?
Yeah.
And yes, you can optimize things. Again, you can sleep, you can eat well, and that puts your body in like an optimal zone to heal. But tissue healing times exist as like for a reason. We know how fast ligaments can heal. We know how fast bone can heal. And there isn't a trick to make that go faster. It's like a standard physiological process that it is going to take a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
If you have a bone stress injury in a certain area, like we know the minimum amount of time that it's going to take. We don't know the maximum because if the minimum is if you have optimized things and you do everything perfectly and you're dealing with life stress, great, but things can always take longer, but they're pretty much never shorter.
Gotcha.
You can't shortcut it.
Yeah, it just is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, you can do your recovery boots and you can do all those things, but the tissue healing timelines are still the tissue healing timelines.
Okay.
And then injury prevention, the same thing. Besides sleep, which is honestly like the most passive thing that you could probably do. Anything passive is probably not going to be the biggest bang for your buck.
Yeah.
If you are wanting to prevent injuries, you actually have to work at it and put in the work.
Yeah.
And not saying that again, like everything is worthless, like massage and all those things, they have their benefits, but you just have to remember like anything passive is probably not going to get you as far as actively working on things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great advice. And I'm guessing that's one of the biggest reasons why more people don't do that, because it is work and it takes, you have to, I remember when I was in physical therapy, they're like, okay, here's what you need to do. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
And
it's going to take how long?
Yeah. And again, it's not fun, sexy stuff, right? It's these exercises, but it was funny. Like one side of my brain was like, look, you want to get better, do these things. And the other side of my brain was like, but I really don't want to. Like, why can't I just, do X, Y, Z? Which again, I'm sure you come across every day in your business.
Yeah. And the amount of money that people will spend on passive treatments, like the ability to get better and not do anything.
Yeah.
But then like the same people will be very reluctant to pay for PT.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. It's just not magic. It's not.
Right. Well, the sport that I feel like is my passion, I know the most about is cycling, and you see it all the time, right? Like people will go out and buy the $15,000 carbon fiber rocket ship, but they won't pay the $150 for the bike fit.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's sort of similar, right? It's all this sort of non-sexy stuff that would really be the performance, see the performance gains versus like, but if I could just spend $3,000 and increase my watts by, 1%, like I could do that too, and I look cooler. So I completely get it. I completely get it.
Have you spent a lot of time on a poorly fitting bike? It feels terrible.
It feels terrible.
Doesn't matter how expensive the bike is.
Yep, you're completely right. You're completely right. So my background is primarily with a working background is in fitness, and I feel like fitness and coaching are very similar in the fact that they're not regulated. There's not a governing body or a federal law, like unlike PTs where you have to be a DPT. as a result, I feel like the scope of practice with coaches is often just not even just, gone over by a little bit. Sometimes it just blows right through where they're, whether it be on the nutrition side, on the injury side. Um, can you discuss, specifically for our listeners, if they're working with a PT or working with their coach more specifically, uh, that some red flags they should look out for, some things that their coach might be saying to them that, okay, this is outside their scope of practice?
Yeah. The biggest thing is when somebody is having pain with running and their coach starts prescribing exercises.
Got it.
Um, that's the biggest thing that I see. I've even had people who I've treated and coach and then have given the exercises that I've given them to other people. And then they've come in and I've been like, "Well, you don't have the same thing." Like
Right. All running injuries are the same.
yeah, I'm like same area, but like this is not the same thing.
Interesting.
And you
Okay.
can really get in trouble with that and make things worse. Because there's a
Yeah.
lot of nuances to even if it was the same thing, that doesn't mean that it needs the same treatment.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think it's one thing if they're prescribing kind of like some prehab exercises if they have the proper education
Yeah.
to do that. It's another thing if they're trying to treat injuries. That's when you're getting into actually like medical treatment.
Yeah.
Um, and people go to school for a very long time for medical treatment.
Yeah.
Not to mention if you don't have eyes on the person and you're just going by what they're saying, the odds that you're really getting a good idea of what's going on is very low.
Sure.
I mean, this gets tricky even with my people since I coach and I'm a PT. Sometimes they'll be telling me, "Hey, this is what's going on," and like sometimes I'll give them like a couple of basic things that it's like, "Okay, try this. Let me know if it feels better." But most of the time, I'm like, "Okay, I have to bring you in. I have to see, like,
Sure.
yeah, I have to put you through some tests, see what provokes it, poke around, actually see what's going on." Um, because again, it's not all the same. And
Yeah.
that ankle pain, you're not going to know it's a hip problem unless you evaluate it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I, I
yeah.
remember even going on just, I mean, it's like you said, it's one thing to just, see someone or running and obviously you don't have the whole picture. But I've even seen stuff where like on these forums online, someone, because people, it's always amazing. People ask these questions to complete strangers, like, hey, the outside of my knee hurts. What is it?
Mhm.
What should I do? I'm like, wow, you're asking like the internet a medical question. And then maybe not shockingly, all these people chime in like, oh, you have patellofemoral syndrome. This is what I did. This is what, and they're like, oh, cool, thanks.
Mhm.
That's awesome. I'm going to go do that. And I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, you just totally diagnosed. Like, so, and that was the other thing, like, in coaching, you would sometimes in these forums, you'd see people diagnosing whatever they think is wrong with the person. I'm like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that's, you can't do that. So, but have you ever had patients come in and be like, oh, I worked with a coach and they said I have XYZ wrong with me? Is that something that you come across with some frequency?
A fairly decent amount.
Okay.
I would say that's actually getting better. And people are getting smarter and just sending them to a PT.
Yeah.
Um, so it hasn't been I haven't seen it as much recently. I
Good.
do see the forums all the time.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. And it kind of just goes back to like, yes, you are asking for free advice from the internet. It is going to be free, but
Yeah.
not all lateral knee pain is your IT band.
Right.
It's not.
Right. Yeah. You'll get the value of what that free
Yeah.
advice.
And nobody can be an expert in anything. So that's
Sure.
where like I get in trouble or get in little tiffs with the coaching, like the coaches around that think they do know everything and
Yeah.
don't like to collaborate.
Yeah.
Whether it's not just with me, it's with nutritionists, sports psych, anybody. Like
Sure.
nobody knows everything.
No.
And the sooner that you figure it out and figure out like where your lane ends, the easier it is to just develop relationships with the people around you so that you have somebody as soon as you're like, "Oop, this is out of my wheelhouse, but I have somebody to send you to."
Yeah.
And you can start to build up those relationships.
Yeah. I think it's so important, and honestly, not just from running a responsible coaching practice, but just for the athlete, this is what,
Yeah.
they need. This is what gets them back on track faster and gets them the gains and hopefully the results they're looking for. So,
Yeah, it kind
um,
of blows my mind when coaches won't talk to me. Let like
is
that
that a, that
that's a
happens with
thing.
some frequency? Interesting.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Interesting.
that they know their athletes coming to see me. They're fine
Yeah,
with them coming to see me. They have no interest in anything I have to say,
that's wild.
right?
That's
A-
wild.
And the athletes know it too. They're like, yeah, they won't talk to you. So just tell me and I'll deal with it.
Okay.
And it blows my mind.
That's so bizarre. That's
And
so bizarre.
it like when in that kind of situation, it's just like who are you trying to help here?
Yeah.
Because it's definitely not your athlete.
Yeah, I mean, and it goes against that whole, I don't know if it's a principle, but saying, it takes a village, and it does,
Hmm.
it takes like all these clinicians and experts and all that kind of stuff. So to cut off communication or to kind of be like, it's even weirder than, okay, I'm okay go with you going to this person, but I want nothing to do with them or I don't want to
Yeah,
hear anything about it is kind of, I don't know, it's just bizarre.
right.
Very
And like I don't
strange.
and I, I have a lot of coaches who do like to talk to me, and then we talk about like,
Sure.
okay, this is what I suggest, like how to adjust their training plan. And they ask like, okay, what about this, and this, and like it's a very much a back and forth. It's not that I'm
Yeah.
getting on the phone to lecture them and be like, you did this, this was
Right.
moronic. It's just to get everybody on the same page for the
Yeah.
benefit of the athlete.
Yeah, for sure. So weird.
It is very
Um,
weird.
So if an athlete is looking to hire a physical therapist for whatever, what are some things that they should be maybe looking for? Some things they should consider? Because again, I think there's a lot of great therapists, like anything out there. There's a lot of probably not so great therapists. There's probably a lot in the middle. So anything that you could tell our listeners that are athletes that might help them in sort of narrowing that down by maybe asking questions or anything like that.
Yeah. So there's kind of like two parts to this question. There's
Okay,
like the therapist themselves, and then there's the structure or the system that the therapist works in.
gotcha.
So obviously like we're in Golden along the Front Range. There there's just a lot of kind of like cash pay healthcare along
Okay,
here. So
okay.
like we're in a very good place for that. That is not an option everywhere. So what I say kind of take with a grain of salt that this is not always possible. Um, but if you're wanting to like, if you're like, let's say, quote unquote, like interviewing somebody to see if you want to go there, the first things I would ask, regardless of even if they like work with runners or anything like that, is how many patients a day do they see, and how
Mm,
much time do they see you for?
okay,
Because the best therapist in the world is not going to get anywhere with you if you are their 16th person of the day and you get to see them for 20 minutes.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
nobody can be on that long. Can you
yeah,
imagine like having back to back to back meetings for your entire day, and then it's 5 p.m. and you're still trying to figure out like this new person who just came in,
yeah,
and you're trying to figure it out in 20 minutes?
yeah,
Like nobody can do that.
right.
Um, so it's more of just like they can be the best therapist in the world, but if they are not in a system that allows them to be the best therapist in the world, you're not going to get great care.
Yeah, that's a
Uh,
great point.
yeah. I mean, you have 20 minutes and like you talk to them for 5, then you have 15 minutes, and yeah, you just anything that's vaguely complex, you are never going to get anywhere because you are not going to be able to actually dig deep enough to look at all the things you need to ask all the questions you need to.
Yeah,
So even if somebody doesn't specifically work with runners, but they're in a system that they get an hour with you, they only see a certain amount of people a day, yada, 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 they are most likely going to give you better care because your relationship with them is going to be better. And they're actually just, they have the brain power
mhm,
to actually think about you as a person and
yeah,
ask you all the questions and talk to you about things
yeah,
versus just when you're in a system that's just milling people through.
yeah. That's a great point, and I think it's a point that probably most people don't even consider when they, when they're seeking out a therapist.
Yeah. So then once you get past that, then you can be kind of like more critical of the actual therapist.
Okay.
If you are truly looking for someone who works with runners or cyclists or whatever, you should be able to ask them to look at your training plan and give you feedback.
Okay.
That's kind of one of the things that's nice about coaching and being a PT. Most injuries come from load management issues.
Okay.
So if we're not looking at your training plan and seeing like, okay, this is where this load management went wrong, you're missing a lot of the problem. So just if they're willing and like competent to look at it, that doesn't mean they have to design you a whole new training plan, but are well versed enough to be able to look at it. That's like a good indicator that they probably know what they're doing in the space.
Interesting. That really makes sense. I would never even thought about that. That makes total sense though.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean like if they're not comfortable with that, they're a terrible PT. It's just like if you're really wanting to whittle down like who is truly specialized in this space, they should be able to do that.
Yeah. Got it.
Yeah. And then another thing is like, what kind of weights do they have, or like what kind of equipment do they have in their clinic? Because if we're talking about loading your Achilles to be able to absorb 12 times your body weight, if they only have 10 to 15 pound dumbbells and that's what they have, like you are not going to get the amount of loading that you need to. So that's kind of just like the environment that they work in. That running is a really high impact sport. You need to load it like such. And if you don't have the equipment to load it, that's a problem in itself.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, all these things, most all these things you discuss, I don't think even be on someone's radar. When it comes to selecting a PT, whether it be the environment, equipment, all that kind of stuff. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and then I mean, if you go through all that stuff, then I'd look at their certifications.
Okay.
If you're in like a really sparse area where there's not a lot of PTs, like the certifications can kind of tell you who has invested into their career a little bit, but they're also not everything. Like my husband, he has his OCS, or so his orthopedic certification through the APTA. I don't, because that covers a lot of like elbow, hand, neck, things that I don't really see a whole lot. So I mean, I've done all of my continuing education focused on runners and endurance athletes. So like I don't have the OCS letters. I don't care. So like that, if you have nothing else, that can be a way to weed people out, but it's not the end all be all.
Okay. So you treat a lot of ultra runners. Obviously there's a lot of ultra runners up in the Golden area, and I guess the whole Front Range area. Anything for ultra runner listeners, anything specifically that you've noted injury wise with ultra runners, anything that our listeners that are ultra runners should be maybe aware of, or anything like that in that ballpark?
Yeah. Stop trying to do more after each race. So you see this all the time. Like you do a marathon, so then you do a 50K, so then you do a 50 miler, so then you do a 100 miler. Like ultra running and running in general, you get better over months to years, and more the years, and your tissue capacity improves over months to years as well. So when people are trying to just always do the next big thing and just have this exponential rise into the sport, your injury risk is going up exponentially. And so that's something that that goes back to the load management, that good coaches should also be having this conversation with their athletes. And because it doesn't matter how well you prehab, if you are going crazy in your training, you are going to get hurt. You might have success for a while, but that's only so sustainable.
So like on borrowed time, so to speak, right?
Yeah. And so people just get really excited when they first get into the sport. I also got really excited. I did this. I can't say that I didn't. My first ultra was 100K, and that was a terrible idea. It went fine at the time, but it was a terrible idea. But yeah, we just think that we always have to do more, or like
Yeah.
ultra runners in particular. And really the slower you do it, the better off you're going to be, and your running is going to be better.
Mhm.
You can't develop like going further, develop speed, develop technical running, and optimize all of those at the same time. It's not possible.
Mhm.
So if you're able to like take a step back and look and plan years out, you can kind of set yourself up for success to be a better runner and less injured,
Yeah.
which also
Yeah.
is going to make you a better runner if you're not
Right.
having to take off weeks, months, however long, and you can actually train consistently.
Right. I was just having this conversation with my business partner. We were talking about, distance, volume, and all that kind of stuff. With respect to like again, you see this on social media all the time. It's like my bucket list goal was to run a marathon, not a 5K, not a 10K,
Hmm.
not a half marathon. So they just do the marathon, and then it's okay. That's done. Like you said, what's next? 50 miler, 100 miler, and it's always volume based. And not that there's anything wrong with that per se, but like you rarely ever see, or at least I don't, like, hey, I run my mile in 8 minutes. I want to get that down to 7 minutes, or yeah, there's been I feel like you used to hear that a lot, and now
Hmm.
there's been this sort of shift to like, if I want to be a badass, it's all volume based. I just have to go further
Yeah.
versus faster, because anything under 100 miles is for losers, almost that sort of like mentality. It's really weird, and I don't, and I mean, we see it in the rise of ultra marathons and ultra running and how popular it's gotten. But I just find that kind of fascinating how there used to be this shift of like, how fast can I go for the mile? And now it's
Hmm.
how far can I go?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And it's interesting that the 100-mile distance seems to be like everybody's like that is what ultra running is.
Yeah.
It's like, or like, and then people end up saying like, oh, I'm just running a 50K or
Yeah.
just running a 50 mile. Like, have you tried
Yeah.
to run a 50K really hard?
Right.
Like it's for a lot of people, even if you're like an experienced ultra runner, it might not be the distance that scares you, but to actually like run it really hard
Yeah.
is really hard.
It's really hard. Like I ran the 800 meters in college, and most people that I talk to say, from a pain perspective at least, there's
Hmm.
nothing worse than the 800. It's the most miserable, 2 minutes or however
Yeah.
long it takes you to. And I don't know if it's because people have an aversion to pain. I mean, probably most smart people have an aversion to pain. Maybe not that running 100 miles isn't painful. It's just a different type of suffering, I suppose. But yeah, it's something I've always been fascinated by, how there's sort of this shift to like just doing more and more and more volume when it comes to events versus, and you see it in triathlon too, right? Sprint, Olympic, half. Yeah, I'll just do the Ironman distance.
Yeah.
That's that's because I want to hear you're an Ironman when you cross the finish line, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but to discount all the other ones because they're not, you know, they're too short is, I always found just bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, I would go a step further and not even say like a really fast 50K is hard. A really fast 5K is really hard.
Yeah, it really is. It is no joke. I mean, yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how things progress, as far as trends. But yeah, it's a real thing out there. That's for sure.
Hmm.
That is for
Yeah.
sure.
And then I mean, similarly with that though, I wish people would start strength training and prehab earlier in their careers
Sure.
too.
Yeah.
They usually have everybody has an aversion to it until they kind of get hurt. And I would say actually the majority of people who I work with long term, they've actually really grown to like the strength training.
Yeah.
It's just that they don't know what to do in the first place.
Sure.
And so it kind of takes a while to get into it. But that's another thing, like the earlier you start it, the more resilient you are making your body from the very beginning until waiting till it breaks, going through that cycle, then being like, okay, I guess I have to do this. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So you're just setting yourself up for success that way.
Yeah. So maybe that leads us to another question then. You know, aside from just general health and fitness, if you want to call it that, would you say that every endurance sport athlete, runner, cyclist, triathlete should be strength training?
Yes. I would say
Okay.
yes in some capacity.
Okay.
That's going to look a lot different from person to person. So I mean like right now is technically kind of like what people would call like the off season or down
Yeah.
season or whatever you want to call it in the ultra running world. So most of my athletes are hitting the strength a lot harder. right now because this is the time of year to do it. But I have people going from like, I have some busy moms who have 2 days a week for 15 minutes, and that's what we do.
Sure.
Yep. And if that's what I've got, that's what I'm going to use. I've got people in the gym 4 days a week. So it depends on what your goals are. It depends on what your life looks like. Everybody should be doing at least something.
Yeah.
But if you're telling me that you don't have 2 times a week for 15 minutes, then you can just cut 15 minutes off of 2 of your runs. You will be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not going to die.
You are not.
Suffer. Well, it's funny in the cycling world. I always laugh because, to your point with the off season, this is the time of year when I always see these pictures of the training camps of these professional teams, and it's almost like this obligatory thing. They have the photo of the team in the gym doing all these, just like squats and push-ups and sit-ups and all this stuff, and they never do any of this stuff during the season ever.
Yeah.
Never. I'm like, why do you even do that? Like, you literally, these guys literally never do this during the season. They just ride 8 million miles, a day or whatever. It's like the whole use it or lose it. I'm always like, what? Why are you even bothering? Like, maybe it's just a photo op. I don't know, but it's just so bizarre to me.
Yeah, and I mean, if that's what you've got, I'd still say it's better than nothing because you are increasing like your resiliency heading into like heavy training.
Yeah.
So you're not going to maintain that strength necessarily, but you are going to it's going to go down on a curve. So you're going to be more resilient for a while.
Yeah.
And not to mention, I mean, when we're talking about endurance sports where people are training like hours and hours and hours, sometimes putting on like a little bit of extra mass, a little bit of extra weight in the winter, especially if it's muscle, can be good. And they eventually lose it when they're doing tons and tons of miles.
Yeah.
But it's still keeping them from going from like a little bit lighter weight if they didn't do that strength training to like way under where they should be to be healthy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. I think with these cyclists, though, they literally only do it for their like week-long training camp.
Yeah. Okay. That's no, that won't
versus to your point, the off season. But
if you're doing the whole off season, sure. If you're doing,
yeah, that's so funny. So
and I mean,
yeah.
Sorry, I was gonna say, and realistically, if even like for like professional cyclists, they're probably still riding more in their off season that they aren't going to put on muscle mass.
Oh yeah, I agree.
So that point might not be completely valid because they're probably doing enough to blunt those adaptations.
Right. And I think that's a good point because I think there is a phobia around weightlifting, resistance training, especially those that don't have any familiarity with it, that they're going to look like, a Mr. Olympia contender overnight, and it's always interesting, I think, because again, all these endurance athletes, they are doing a lot of cardio. Those guys don't do any cardio aside from when they're in their cutting phase. It's a completely different sport or activity. But there is that phobia, and it's like, and maybe at the elite level, like a cyclist that maybe, that extra half pound matters when you're climbing out Duez or something. For the rest of us, it's like, it's health. It's, it's just being stronger, being able to function on a daily basis, and enjoy your sport.
Yeah, it's called the interference effect. Like, it has a name and everything. It's well researched. If you you're like a moderate volume endurance athlete and you do heavy lifting in the gym, you will not put on muscle.
Yeah.
You don't have the extra energy to do that.
Yeah.
You can think about like how much food it requires to just sustain your running.
Yeah.
The amount more food that you need to then be like to build muscle and be anabolic is so much, because running is a catabolic sport. Like, you're just kind of breaking things down. Lifting is anabolic. So in order to actually build muscle, you have to be taking in more than you're burning running, and enough to build muscle on top of that. And even if you do that, the biochemistry and the mechanisms are probably still not going to let you put on very much.
Yeah. And I feel like that's so misunderstood. I mean, when I was working in this gym, I worked with a competitive bodybuilder, and I mean, all this guy did all day, I mean, he ate the exact same thing. It was all, the same. He ate like 8 meals during a
Hmm.
8 hour workday. I mean, he gets so many calories. I mean, yeah, I mean, you have to put a really concerted effort. And again, he wasn't doing any cardio. You have to put in a big effort to put on mass. It was just, it was really, I mean, I had read about bodybuilders, I sort of knew about it, but to actually see it in person and what they did, I was like, wow, that's intense.
Yeah. And I mean, so they really should not do cardio
Yeah,
because, well, should not for bodybuilding,
for a
for health,
bodybuilder,
and
right?
but but because of the interference effect, because
Yeah,
running and aerobic work decreases the amount of muscle that you can put on. So if the goal is to put on muscle, you're probably not going to be running.
right, right.
So it does
Yeah,
go both ways.
yeah. No, that
Yep.
makes sense. That completely makes sense. So, last question for you, and some of these we already sort of discussed, but what are some common things, some maybe common training mistakes that you see uh, athletes doing that they end up in to see you or Gabe?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing is doing too much too fast.
Yeah,
That's again, like coaches should be on top of this, but not everybody's coached also.
sure.
But I think especially in the time of like social media and Strava, it's just so easy to look at what other people are doing and be like, ooh, I should be doing that. Or they're running
Mm,
40 miles a week or whatever. There's just such a comparison game that it's really hard for people to strategically, gradually build over years.
yeah,
Also, humans are just naturally like very instant gratification driven.
sure.
So planning in the span of years is really, really hard for people.
Yeah, it is. Now,
Um,
have you noticed? Sorry to interrupt. Have you noticed that the social media effect then, whether it be Strava, Facebook, whatever, of people be, especially those people that are kind of just innately competitive, that gets them into trouble then?
a little bit.
Okay.
And then I'm always getting questions about like people send me Instagram posts and like, what do you think of this? Or like podcasts of like, what
Okay.
about this? And um, especially when it's in podcasts, I usually listen like anything that people send me, I look at it and be like, okay, this is why they're wrong or what the research says, or if
Okay.
it's actually like, okay, like they've got a good
Yeah,
point there.
right.
Um, yeah, I'm pretty blunt with it. I don't know, people getting again out of their scope and like making claims is a really big, like it strikes a nerve with me. So,
Sure. As it should.
yeah, Gabe and our other business partner Mark have heard me on a lot of rants.
Okay. Got it. That's funny. That's funny. But no, it is. I mean, I know I'm not a clinician, I'm not a physical therapist, but even, just seeing the things I see on social media are just infuriating. And more to the point, how many people are like, oh, cool, that's awesome because you run a 4 minute mile. So
Yeah.
obviously it's true. Or you won XYZ ultramarathon. So it must be true. And so there's also that weird association with like good athletic ability with training practices. Like you might be terrible. You just chose good parents.
Hmm. Yeah, especially with like the elite athlete world of like, oh, they're doing this, so this is what we should do. I mean, there's even
Yeah.
articles of like, well, what can we learn about Courtney from like Courtney DeWalter's training? And I'm like, unless you have her genes, nothing.
Right. Right. Right.
Nobody listening to this podcast can do exactly what she does.
Yeah.
It
Right.
works for her. I'm not going to tell her to change a thing, but
Yep.
it is not the norm, not the thing that you should be going after. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point because I do think because again, a lot of those magazines, at least I used to like bicycling, runner's world, all that, like
Hmm.
how to train like XYZ. And because again, it's those sort of like sexy headlines. You're like, oh yeah, I want to, of course, run like Courtney and be that
Hmm.
fast. So I definitely will do what her training program is, and obviously that gets a lot of people into trouble.
Yeah, and even if you do have fantastic genes, do you have the same background? Like
Right.
have you been running for the same amount of time? Do you have the same about like she was a really good Nordic skier before? Like do you have that background of developing your cardio system?
Yeah.
Do you have whatever background of developing tendons, bones, all those things that we were already talking about?
Yeah.
So it's really easy to compare and really easy to get caught up in it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of our earlier podcasts, one of our contributors to the running certification is Noah Rojas, the professional runner for marathon runner for Nike. And it was really interesting what she had to say. We spoke about this similar topic, and she goes, one of the things, because she's also a coach,
Mhm.
she has a degree in exercise science. She goes, one of the things she stresses to her athletes is like when it comes to in comparison to her, she goes, this literally is my job. So when I get back from a run, I just lay around on the couch. That's literally my job, is to recover. As you mentioned, how important sleep is. And
Mhm.
she's like, I don't have a job to go to. I don't sit at a desk all day. And she goes, so even if everything else were equal, or genetics or whatever, I don't have all these other stressors and things that you do, And so it was really, so it was just funny hearing of her. She's like, she clearly gets it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
So
mean, you ask people, especially people who I see who have had things going on for a long time, and like months to years, of like, when is your pain the worst? Is it? And they're like, oh, well, like I just had a lot of these things happened at my job and these things happened at home. And it doesn't even necessarily have to do with their spikes in running volume, but the body can only handle so much stress.
yeah,
It doesn't know just physical stress and just running stress. It knows stress. So if there's all these other areas of your life that are stressing you out,
yeah,
you can have and often do have physical manifestations of
sure,
that stress.
yeah.
Unfortunately, running is the thing that people want to keep doing at the same amount. They're like, but that's the part of my life that I love.
Right.
Um, so convincing them to like bring it down a notch. Again, I almost never tell people to stop running.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, the option is take care of this with dropping the volume a little bit while you're getting the rest of this life stress sorted out,
Yeah.
or keep it, probably get more injured and have to completely stop running.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And
so
that's a really good point, because I think most people probably, they probably compartmentalize all those other stresses that aren't running. They don't see the correlation, right, between
mhm,
that and injury. They probably go, well, that's a different kind of
yeah,
stress. That doesn't
that's
equate
my
to
stress.
me being
That's my
injured, right?
stress relief. That's what I
Yes.
hear all the time. Is that's my stress
Ah,
relief. Yeah,
okay. Okay. Don't take that away from me,
yeah.
please.
And so I try really hard not to, but it might have to just come down a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right. That's a great point about sort of managing the whole person. I was actually, have you heard of that professional bodybuilder Ronnie Coleman?
I don't.
He won, like, I think it was like 8 Mr. Olympias. I mean, the guy was like a total freak show. Now he's uses crutches. He's had 8 back surgeries.
Mm,
But they did I think it was a Netflix special on him. It was fascinating. They talked to his surgeon, and they said, he's still going to the gym every day, even though the guy can barely walk. And he's like, would you still advise him doing this? He's like, well, I advise him not to lift heavy. He's like, from a clinic, like a medical perspective, no, I don't think it's a good idea. He's like, but this is his entire life. Without this, he would just fall apart, basically.
hmm.
So if we're just mentally, I'm not going to stop him from doing what he loves. And, so it's kind of what you were saying about running, it was just really interesting, like how this surgeon kind of got it, that this was his identity. This is what made him happy. And he's like, look, just don't bench press 8 trillion pounds. But I still would prefer you not to do all this, but I know you're going to anyway.
Yeah. That's pretty good for a surgeon. They're not
Yeah.
known for like their holistic bedside
Right.
manner. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we definitely pride ourselves on is not just telling people not to run. We
Yeah.
see people a lot of time who have been to see like 3, 4 providers and they're like, stop running so much. Like,
Yeah.
well, that to me is, as a like a medical practitioner, that is the lazy answer.
Right.
That is the I am not trying to help you.
Hmm.
I'm just going to tell you to stop
Yeah.
because this seems silly to me. So
Right.
stop.
Right. Just don't do
Um,
that anymore.
right. So again, like a lot of times we have to make adjustments. Um, Pretty much the only times I like get people to like they have to stop running is bone stress injuries. And that's just
Yeah.
the nature of them. You just have to.
Right. Right.
Almost everything else you can continue some type of training. It might look different. Like we might have to decrease the volume, we might have to decrease the intensity, we might have to do a walk run.
Yeah.
But if that's something that's like important to you and needed for your mental health, you're not going to care that you have to walk 1 minute every 5 minutes. You care
Sure.
that you're out there and still being able to do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that you guys take that approach to it. That's awesome. That's awesome. Cool. Well, I think that's all the questions I had. Was there anything else you wanted to kind of add at all to the conversation that you feel like our listeners might get added value from?
I think we hit most things. Thank you for
Yeah.
giving me an hour-long soapbox.
Yeah, of course. We'll have to do another one of these as well, kind of extend on that soapbox. We chat about some other things.
I've got
related
plenty
to
of
physical
content.
therapy. Okay, we'll powwow back and forth and figure out the next podcast topic.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sammie, for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. And for any of our listeners that you know that live in the Golden area, at the outro we'll put on your website's name, and they can maybe come and pay you a visit.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.